Now we have a moment in the history of our beloved country finally to deal with the Trudeau-Castros and traitors Kennys. It's about time for Canadians to rise up and start roaring.
Let's go!
I'm talking about peaceful resolution. I'm not talking about guns and swords. You see, this image right here, it was the most powerful thing I could ever do. And it went viral all over the world because it showed simply me on my knees in the middle of the highway being taken by SWAT team. Why? For inciting people to come to church, participating in illegal church gathering, and officiating a church service. Who do those people think they are?
You know, the decision isn't right when you look at civil liberties, when you look at protesting, when you look at expression. You know, there's not a big jump from what Artur said in Coots and what you could see any number of people saying online about the trucker protest, or what you could see any number of people saying about the Fairy Creek protests, which are one of the biggest protests in Canada and resulted in the most arrests, right? And it's concerning to think if you express support for an illegal protest, or express support for the idea of an illegal protest, or express support for what they have chosen or not chosen to do during that protest, that you may be charged and convicted and get a criminal record for inciting mischief. So we've appealed.
Adam Sills here for Rebel News, joined once again by Sarah Miller, who has been sort of at the vanguard of Pastor Artur Pawlowski's legal defense for years now, since the onset. He was sort of one of the first tickets when COVID kicked up, one of our first Fight the Fines recipients. We've obviously been fundraising for him at saveartur.com. Now, throughout the course of all of that, whether it be for keeping his church open, the litany of things goes on. It's been legal victory after legal victory. Some of them took appeals. Some of them took a lot of hard, long hours in courts. But thanks to folks' donations, there's been victories on every front, except one. And that's being appealed. I suspect it's going to be a victory too. And if you can bring people up to speed, but for me, the mischief charge relating to the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act seemed to me like the least likely to stick out of everything he's faced, and yet it's the one we're still talking about. So can you sort of set the scene for folks who maybe aren't aware of the one sort of pending charge against Pastor Artur Pawlowski?
Yeah, so back when Coots was having the truckers protest, Mr. Pawlowski went down day 6 or something and spoke to the crowd there. And of course it was recorded and, distributed online and things of that nature. And he was charged with inciting mischief.
But I decided to come here because I believe that the eyes of the world are fixed on this place, right here. Yes, this little pitiful piece of land. And the eyes of the world are fixed right here on you guys. You are the heroes of the solidarity movement. Don't you dare breaking the line. The whole world is watching you. I was on 60 radio stations driving here, and Americans are saying this to us: when you're done with your tyrants, please come to America and help us do the revolution.
And so we had a trial back in February of this year. We got the decision from the Court of Justice that he would be convicted back in May, and then he was sentenced to 60 days custody. Now, whether it's lucky or unlucky for Artur, he had already served that time because he was detained on his first bail hearing.
Right.
So he didn't serve any additional time. He, of course, is thrilled about that. The Crown was seeking up to 12 months at one point. So, but he now is convicted, first criminal charge that he's been convicted of. And we argued before the Court of Justice that, him speaking at a protest is not inciting mischief. Anybody expressing support of a protest is not inciting it. And those arguments were dismissed by the Court of Justice. He was convicted. We take the position that, the decision isn't right when you look at civil liberties, when you look at protesting, when you look at expression. There's not a big jump from what Artur said in Coots and what you could see any number of people saying online about the trucker protest.
Now we have a moment in the history of our beloved country finally to deal with the Trudeau-casters and traitors Kennys. It's about time for Canadians to rise up and start roaring.
Let's go!
I'm talking about peaceful resolution. I'm not talking about guns and swords. You see, this image right here, it was the most powerful thing I could ever do. And it went viral all over the world because it showed simply me on my knees in the middle of the highway being taken by SWAT team. Why? For inciting people to come to church, participating in illegal church gathering, and officiating a church service. Who do those people think they are?
Or what you could see any number of people saying about the Fairy Creek protests, which are one of the biggest protests in Canada and resulted in the most arrests, right? And it's concerning to think if you express support for an illegal protest or express support for the idea of an illegal protest or express support for what they have chosen or not chosen to do during that protest, that you may be charged and convicted and get a criminal record for inciting mischief. So we've appealed.
Well, even praying for peace at a protest, not necessarily even outright encouraging it, but just showing up as a pastor, praying for people to be safe and stand by their convictions. If you could sort of remind me, with the court proceedings, I believe originally there was sort of more to the critical infrastructure. Was it like three-pronged and they dropped off some towards the end? If you could remind folks about how that sort of unfolded.
Yeah, so in Alberta, we have the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act, and it's supposed to prevent protest groups or individuals from interfering with critical infrastructure in Alberta. Things like pipelines, highways, railroads, that kind of thing. It's never been, to our knowledge, never been used and nobody's ever been charged under it except for Artur Pawlowski. Now, we could be wrong, but as far as we know, Artur Pawlowski is the only person to be charged under it.
Right.
And he was convicted of that as well. But there's a principle, it's a pineapple principle, where you're not going to be charged, or you can be charged, but you're not going to be convicted of two offenses of the same nature, right? So when he was charged with mischief and the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act, it was always really presumed that he would only ever carry one of those convictions forward. So he was convicted of both, and the Crown stayed the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act ticket because they couldn't continue with both for the purposes of sentencing. So pursuant to pineapple. So of course that means that we couldn't pursue any of our constitutional challenges against that particular act. AUPE had previously, prior to Mr. Pawlowski being charged under it, they had sought to constitutionally challenge it. They were held to be speculative because they weren't actually charged under it. They just wanted to challenge the legislation. There's a whole argument about public interest standing that might be a little bit legalese and boring for most, but it's a very hotly contested act that we don't believe is constitutional, and we wanted to make those arguments and lost the opportunity to. So we just have the mischief, and then the third charge was the breach of his release. So he was under release conditions of keeping the peace and being of good behavior, and so he was also convicted of that.
Right. So it's interesting, again, we just spoke not long ago about the Pastor Derek Reimer charge being dropped, and about how is there sort of an interest, whether it be from the Crown or the courts, but in most cases the Crown, to not engage in conversations on constitutional issues. This appeal process with the two other charges going forward, is there constitutional grounds to the appeal? Like, are we finally going to actually get conversations around constitutional and charter rights heard in the courts?
Yeah, so certainly that will be part of our argument. Now, it won't be the constitutional notice that we filed regarding CEDA, the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act, but there is a section of the criminal code, section 429 sub 2, that talks about legal justification, and the cases outside of Alberta have inferred that legal justification includes constitutional rights, constitutional issues. So that will be part of our argument before the Court of Appeal. It's possible that the Court of Appeal dismiss or grants the appeal and dismisses the charges under different pretenses. I can't promise that the Court of Appeal is going to grapple with any of the constitutional issues, but it's certainly going to be a main thrust of our argument.
So, and obviously, you can't predict the courts, the outcome, but most of this going in, like there are other things where it was like, oh, what is going to be the outcome? This one at face value, at least, seemed not likely to stick, and it seems to be the one that is holding on the longest. Is there an inclination or an impression among your colleagues either way, or is there a way to gauge this?
I don't have a way to gauge it. After the last round going into the Court of Appeal, the decision from the lower court was kind of baffling to me. The Court of Appeal did turn around a decision in our favor quite quickly. In my impression, quite quickly. I of course hope that is the case here, that the court turns around, sees this argument, understands it, turns around a decision in our favor quite quickly. And not only for my client, but also for all Albertans who want to express themselves online or in person or however they do it, without being alleged to have incited anything.
Right. Now, this is sort of for Pastor Artur Pawlowski, at least extending from COVID-19 restrictions, the sort of last major legal battle. So he's been at this for years. What is the timeline for him? Are we just waiting on a result? Are you going to be back in court in the near future? What's the timeline?
So we have to do a few steps at the Court of Appeal first. So we have to put forward our appeal record. We have to put forward our evidence. We have to put forward, which is just, copying the evidence essentially from the lower court. We have to put forward our written argument. And then the government prosecutors get to give their written argument. And once we receive that, then we can requisition the court for a hearing date. I don't know exactly what that timing is going to look like, but I would say probably August or September of next year when we're actually before the court arguing it. But I might be off by a couple months.
Wonderful. Well, I'm sure, Pastor Artur, you have been working on this for years. It'll be great to have a final resolution. Hopefully some more wins. It seems all we've had is wins as of late, as far as your legal team, as far as these pastors who have been facing prosecution and persecution, I would suggest, for some time. Sarah Miller, I want to thank you for always being available for these updates. I'm sure folks like to get the legal expertise directly from the experts. So I want to thank everyone so much for tuning in. Don't forget to chip in at saveartur.com to help ensure that these pastors can have their day in court. And as always, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Sos. It is abundantly clear to anyone paying attention that the folks who are taking a stand, fighting for their rights, particularly these pastors, simply could not do it without you. The massive weight of government and Crown resources are against them. And if it wasn't for you chipping in, taking a stand, and helping them hire lawyers, they wouldn't be able to fight back. So I want to encourage you, as the fight for Pastor Artur Pawlowski's freedom is nearly coming to an end with this appeal, to, if you're able, make one last donation at saveartur.com.